My name is Jonathan Hayes, 58 years old, and for the past 6 months, my family has believed me to be slowly succumbing to a rare, aggressive neurodegenerative disorder in a quiet, private clinic nestled in the Swiss Alps. At least, that was the narrative I had carefully constructed for their consumption. The truth, as is often the case when dealing with my esteemed parents, Arthur and Beatrice Hayes, and my ambitious younger sister, Clarissa, was a far more complex and, I must admit, strategically orchestrated affair. Today, however, was not about the intricacies of experimental gene therapies or the surprising resilience of the human body. Today was about observing the final act of a rather grim play I had set in motion, a play designed to reveal the true nature of familial bonds when tested by the seductive allure of anticipated wealth. From a discreetly rented office space across the street, offering a clear, if slightly oblique, view into the polished mahogany world of Thomas Ashton, my solicitor and longtime confidant, I watched them arrive. Arthur, ever the patriarch even in his declining years, leaned heavily on his cane, his face a carefully arranged mask of somber concern that didn't quite reach his shrewd, calculating eyes. Beatrice, my mother, dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, a performance of grief she had likely rehearsed. And Clarissa, my dear sister, resplendent in a designer suit that probably cost more than my first car, exuded an aura of impatient, barely concealed avarice. They were here, precisely on schedule, for what they believed would be a solemn discussion with Thomas regarding the inevitable transition of assets from their supposedly dying son and brother. They had no idea that the primary asset in question, my life, was not, in fact, transitioning anywhere but back to a state of robust health. The irony was a bitter pill, one I had been forced to swallow many times over the years when dealing with their particular brand of affection, an affection that always seemed to run parallel to and often be eclipsed by their keen interest in my financial statements. My decision to embark on this elaborate charade had not been born of malice, not initially. It had begun with a genuine health crisis, a diagnosis that was indeed serious, with a prognosis that was at best uncertain. The experimental treatment in Switzerland was a long shot, a Hail Mary pass in the final quarter of a very challenging game. When I had broken the news to my family, their reactions had been illuminating. There were the requisite expressions of shock, the performative tears from Beatrice, the bluff, hollow assurances from Arthur that I was a fighter and would beat this thing. Clarissa had been particularly solicitous, offering to help manage my affairs to reduce my stress during this difficult time. But beneath the surface, I had detected an unmistakable undercurrent, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their focus. Their questions, cloaked in concern, began to veer with increasing frequency towards the practicalities of my estate, the structure of my investments, the location of important documents. It was as if my impending demise was not so much a tragedy to be mourned, but a complex logistical problem to be efficiently managed for their ultimate benefit. That was when the seed of this current endeavor had been planted. If my life was indeed drawing to a close, perhaps there was one final important piece of research to conduct, one last data set to analyze. The true measure of my family's love, unclouded by the expectation of my continued presence, or my continued financial support. And so, with Thomas Ashton's discreet and invaluable assistance, the narrative of my slow decline in a Swiss clinic had been carefully crafted, complete with periodic, grim updates relayed by Thomas, and a carefully managed silence from my end, attributed to my rapidly deteriorating condition. I had, in essence, become a ghost in my own life, observing from the spectral sidelines as my family prepared to divide the spoils. The office I now occupied was Spartan, functional, a stark contrast to the plush comfort of Thomas's chambers across the street. A high-powered telescope, disguised as an architectural surveyor's instrument, was trained on Thomas's window. A secure, encrypted audio feed, relayed from a discreet device Thomas had activated, allowed me to hear their conversation. It was an unconventional setup, perhaps, but my career in software development had taught me the value of robust data collection and secure, remote access. Today, the system was performing flawlessly. I watched as Thomas greeted them, his demeanor a perfect blend of professional sympathy and quiet efficiency. He offered condolences for my grave condition, expressed his admiration for their strength during this trying period, and then, with a subtle shift in tone, he would begin to guide them towards the topic at hand. My last will and testament, or so they believed. The curtain was rising on the final act, and I, the supposedly absent protagonist, was settled in for a command performance, notebook and pen at the ready. The data, I suspected, will be both damning and, in a grimly satisfying way, entirely predictable. My journey to this rather unorthodox observation post had been a long and, for the most part, solitary one. I built my software company, exaggerating Solutions, from the ground up, starting in a cramped Silicon Valley garage with 2 borrowed computers and an idea that most industry veterans at the time had dismissed as unworkable. It was the early days of AI-driven logistical optimization, and I saw a future that others couldn't or wouldn't envision. The hours were brutal, the setbacks frequent, but the intellectual challenge, the sheer joy of building something complex and elegant from nothing but code and determination, was its own reward. Success, when it finally came, was substantial. Innovatech became a major player, acquired by a global tech conglomerate. For a sum that had made my family's eyes widen with a mixture of disbelief and a sudden, intense, and entirely uncharacteristic interest in my well-being. Throughout those early, lean years, my family's presence in my life had been peripheral. Arthur, my father, a man whose own business ventures had a tendency to implode with spectacular regularity, viewed my quiet dedication to software as some form of arcane, unprofitable hobby. "When are you going to get a real job, Jonathan?" He'd often ask during his infrequent calls, his tone implying that my efforts were somehow less legitimate than his latest ill-fated foray into emu farming or artisanal pickle production. Beatrice, my mother, was more concerned with appearances. Her primary anxiety seemed to be that I wasn't providing her with enough material for her bridge club boasts. Clarissa's husband, Gerald, just made partner at his law firm, she'd sigh, and they're looking at a lovely little place in the Hamptons. It's so important to have visible success, don't you think, dear? Clarissa, my sister, had always been the golden child, effortlessly charming, socially adept, and possessed of an almost preternatural ability to land on her feet, usually by leveraging someone else's resources. Her marriage to Gerald, a man whose ambition was matched only by his capacity for self-congratulation, had solidified her position as the family's designated success story, at least in their eyes. My own quiet, for a long time, unlucrative pursuits were a source of mild embarrassment, a slight deviation from their preferred narrative of upwardly mobile respectability. The acquisition of Innovatech changed all that, or rather, it changed their perception of me. Suddenly, I was no longer Jonathan, the eccentric software nerd, but Jonathan Hayes, the tech millionaire. The phone calls became more frequent. The invitations to family gatherings, which I had often managed to politely decline, became more insistent, and the requests for financial assistance began to arrive with an almost metronomic regularity. Arthur needed seed money for a revolutionary new line of self-stirring mugs. Beatrice required a substantial contribution towards the re-roofing of the local historical society building, society she had shown no prior interest in, but whose board was chaired by the very influential Mrs. Albright Smythe. Clarissa, having decided that her true calling was interior design, needed a small investment to launch her boutique consultancy, Clarissa Concepts, which seemed to primarily involve redecorating her own already lavishly appointed home and billing me for the privilege. I had, for a time, acquiesced. It was easier than enduring the guilt trips, the wounded expressions, the subtle but persistent pressure. And a part of me, I suppose, still harbor naive hope that this newfound interest, however financially motivated, might somehow bridge the emotional chasm that had always existed between us. It did not. The more I gave, the more they expected. My successes were no longer my own. They were a communal resource, a well from which they felt entitled to draw at will. My attempts to discuss my work, my passions, were met with polite but vacant stares, their eyes glazing over until the conversation inevitably veered back to their own needs, their own projects, their own desires, all of which, coincidentally, required a substantial infusion of my capital. The diagnosis of my illness, a rare and aggressive form of amyloidosis that affected the nervous system, had been a brutal shock. The initial prognosis was grim. Conventional treatments offered little hope. It was my own research, my desperate dive into the world of experimental medicine, that had led me to the clinic in Switzerland, a place on the cutting edge of gene therapy, offering a sliver of a chance where none had seemed to exist. When I informed my family about the diagnosis and my decision to pursue this last-ditch treatment, their reactions were, as I mentioned, illuminating. But it was more than just their barely concealed anticipation of my demise. It was their complete lack of genuine empathy, their almost clinical detachment from my suffering, that truly crystallized my understanding of our relationship. There were no offers to accompany me to Switzerland, no heartfelt expressions of a desire to spend precious time together. Instead, there was a flurry of questions about my will, about powers of attorney, about the arrangements I had made. Clarissa even had the audacity to suggest that, to simplify things, I should perhaps transfer some of my major assets into a joint account with her, just for ease of management, darling, while you're unwell. It was then, in the sterile confines of a specialist consulting room, faced with my own mortality and the stark, unvarnished truth of my family's affections, that I made a decision. If I was going to fight for my life, if I was going to endure the rigors of an uncertain and potentially grueling treatment, then I owed it to myself to ensure that the fruits of my life's work would not be casually plundered by those who had valued the fruit far more than the tree that bore it. I contacted Thomas Ashton immediately. Thomas had been my solicitor since the early days of Innovatech, a man of unimpeachable integrity and razor-sharp intellect. I laid out my medical situation, my concerns about my family, and my desire to create a contingency plan, not just a standard will, but something more dynamic, something that would allow me to observe, to assess, and ultimately to act based on their behavior. The idea of the slow decline in a Swiss clinic was born. Thomas, initially hesitant about the ethics of such a deception, eventually came to understand my reasoning. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity. It was about ensuring that my legacy, whatever it might be, would be handled according to my true wishes, unclouded by 11th hour manipulations or crocodile tears. We drew up a comprehensive power of attorney, giving Thomas full discretionary control over my affairs should I become incapacitated. We also drafted a series of communications, updates on my condition, to be relayed to my family at carefully timed intervals. And then there was the letter that Thomas was at this very moment likely preparing to introduce into the conversation across the street. A letter from a man they believed to be on his deathbed, a letter that would, I hoped, serve as the ultimate reveal, the final, irrefutable data point in my long and painful assessment of their characters. The experimental treatment had been arduous, but miraculously successful. The recovery was slow, but steady. I had chosen to keep my remarkable progress a secret, even from Thomas initially, until I was strong enough to return to set this final stage. Now, hidden in plain sight, I was ready to witness the unveiling, to see if years of quiet generosity and overlooked affection had earned me anything more than a place on their list of anticipated windfalls. The Performance Inn. Thomas's office was about to take a very unexpected turn. Across the street, in Thomas Ashton's impeccably appointed conference room, the atmosphere, as relayed through my discreet audio feed, was one of strained solemnity. Thomas, a master of understated gravitas, was expressing his profound sympathy for my rapidly deteriorating condition. His voice was a carefully modulated blend of professional concern and personal sorrow, a performance worthy of the West End stage. "Jonathan asked me," Thomas was saying, his tone heavy with manufactured reluctance, "to initiate these discussions now, to ensure that his wishes are clearly understood, and to ease the burden on you all during what will inevitably be a most difficult time ahead." Arthur cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. "Very considerate of him, Thomas. Always was a thoughtful boy, in his own way. Though, frankly, this whole Swiss clinic business, a bit theatrical, if you ask me. Good old British common sense is what he needed." Beatrice dabbed at her eyes again, though the handkerchief, I noted with a forensic accountant's eye for detail, remained stubbornly pristine. "Oh, Arthur, don't be so harsh. He's trying his best, poor lamb. It's just so tragic. So young, so much potential." Her voice caught, a beautifully executed tremor of maternal grief. Clarissa, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward, her voice a silken purr. "Thomas, darling, while we appreciate the sentiment, and of course, we're all utterly devastated, perhaps we could move on to the more practical aspects. Jonathan would want us to be sensible, to ensure everything is handled efficiently. He always valued efficiency." Efficiency? Yes, Clarissa had always valued efficiency, especially when it came to accessing my resources. I could almost see Thomas's internal wince, though his outward demeanor remained impeccably composed. "Of course, Clarissa," he said smoothly. "Jonathan has indeed prepared a comprehensive overview of his estate and his intentions regarding its disposition. He felt it was important for you all to be fully appraised." He rustled some papers, the sound crisp and authoritative through my earpiece. I watched through the telescope as he slid a neatly bound document across the polished mahogany table towards Arthur. My father picked it up, his brow furrowed, adjusting his spectacles. He began to read, his lips moving silently. Beatrice leaned in, peering over his shoulder. Clarissa, unable to contain her impatience, reached for her own copy. For a few moments, the only sound was the rustle of turning pages. Then a small, choked gasp from Beatrice. "Good heavens, Arthur! Look at this! The donations!" Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes, magnified by his glasses, wide with disbelief. "Charitable endowments? To the Royal Society for the Preservation of Obscure Software? The National Archive of Defunct Operating Systems? What in blazes is this, Thomas?" Clarissa let out a sound that was halfway between a snort and a sob. "He can't be serious. The man is clearly delirious. This is throwing good money after bad code." Thomas raised a calming hand. "If I may," he interjected, his voice still a model of sympathetic understanding. "Jonathan has, in recent weeks, expressed a profound desire to ensure that his life's work, the intellectual property he created, is preserved for posterity. These endowments, while perhaps unconventional, reflect his deep commitment to the history and evolution of software development. He feels it is a vital part of our technological heritage." "Heritage?" Arthur sputtered. "It's a bunch of outdated algorithms, Thomas. This is madness. There must be hundreds of thousands, millions earmarked for this nonsense." The preliminary estimates for the initial endowments do indeed approach a significant seven-figure sum. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, his tone implying that this was a perfectly normal, if somewhat eccentric, act of philanthropic foresight. I allowed myself a small, grim smile. This was Phase 1 of the letter's directives. The establishment of a series of well-funded, if decidedly niche, charitable trusts dedicated to the very things my family had always dismissed as my unprofitable obsessions. It was a move designed not just to reduce the size of the anticipated inheritance, but also to highlight, in a very public and legally binding way, what I truly valued as opposed to what they valued. The beauty of it was its plausibility. Given my known passion for the history of computing and my supposed end-of-life clarity, such bequests, however substantial, would be difficult to challenge as irrational or out of character. Difficult, but not, I suspected, impossible for my avaricious family to attempt. "This is an outrage," Clarissa declared, her voice rising. "He's clearly not a sound mind. Thomas, you can't possibly allow this. We need to contest this. He's being taken advantage of by these software librarians." "Clarissa, please," Thomas said, his voice firm but still gentle. Jonathan was perfectly lucid when he made these provisions. He consulted extensively with experts in philanthropic planning. He was quite insistent that these endowments form a cornerstone of his legacy. He paused, then added, with a touch of subtle irony that I, at least, appreciated. He said it was his way of ensuring that the foundational code of our digital world receives the same respect and preservation as, say, a first folio of Shakespeare or a Gutenberg Bible. An archivist's sentiment, perhaps, but one he holds very dearly. Beatrice was now openly weeping, her lace handkerchief finally seeing some genuine action. "But what about us, Thomas? What about his family? Doesn't he care about our future, our security?" Her voice was a plaintive wail, the raw sound of thwarted expectation. I thought back to all the times I tried to share my world with them, my excitement over a breakthrough in algorithm design, my fascination with the elegant logic of a piece of early code. Their eyes would glaze over, their attention would wander, until the conversation could be safely steered back to topics they understood: property values, stock market tips, Clarissa's latest social triumph. They had never cared about my legacy, only about its liquidation value. Now, a significant portion of that value was being irrevocably dedicated to the very things they had so consistently disdained. It was a form of poetic justice, written in the dry, precise language of trust deeds and endowment charters. But this, I knew, was only the overture. The main symphony of revelation, the true contents of the letter, was yet to come. Thomas was now shuffling another set of papers. The air in his office, even through the slightly distorted audio feed, felt thick with a new, more personal tension. The vultures were agitated, their anticipated feast dramatically reduced. Now it was time to remind them why. Thomas cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the sudden, tense silence of the conference room. I watched, a detached observer, as he picked up a single, heavy cream-colored envelope from the stack of documents before him. It was sealed with my personal signet ring, an archaic affectation I'd adopted years ago, a small nod to the historical minutiae I so enjoyed. It was, I knew, the envelope containing the letter, my true, unvarnished final statement to my family. "There is one further matter Jonathan wished me to address with you directly," Thomas said, his voice taking on a new, more somber gravity. He was very specific that this should be read only after the charitable dispositions had been outlined. He felt it provided necessary context. He carefully broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper a small, sharp punctuation mark in the oppressive quiet. He unfolded the pages, written in my own hand, a deliberate choice to lend an undeniable authenticity to the words. My family watched him, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and a new, dawning suspicion. The earlier outrage over the charitable endowments had momentarily subsided, replaced by an uneasy anticipation. They sensed, perhaps, that this was not going to be a conventional deathbed farewell. "Thomas," Clarissa began, her voice tight, "if this is more about obscure software archives—" "No, Clarissa," Thomas interrupted gently but firmly. "This is not about software. This is about family." He adjusted his spectacles and began to read. His voice, usually so brisk and professional, now carried the weight of my own carefully chosen words, my own long-suppressed emotions. "To my dearest family, Arthur, Beatrice, and Clarissa," Thomas read, his gaze sweeping over their faces. If Thomas is reading this to you, it means that the narrative of my declining health has reached its anticipated denouement in your minds. It also means that my primary charitable bequests, dedicated to the preservation of our technological heritage, a heritage you have collectively and consistently dismissed as trivial, have been duly communicated. I trust this initial distribution of my estate has been illuminating. I saw Arthur flinch. Beatrice's hand went to her mouth. Clarissa's eyes narrowed. Illuminating, Thomas continued, reading my words, because it underscores a truth that has been painfully apparent to me for many years. That my true passions, the work that has defined my life and generated the very wealth you are now so keen to administer, have always been, in your eyes, of secondary importance to your own, more immediate material concerns. I had then detailed in calm, precise language a series of specific instances, flashbacks to moments of casual cruelty, of dismissive remarks, of blatant financial opportunism that had characterized our relationship for decades. The time Arthur had borrowed a substantial sum for another of his failed ventures, a sum never repaid, never even acknowledged. The time Beatrice had openly lamented to her bridge club, within my earshot, that it was such a shame Jonathan hadn't gone into a more lucrative and understandable profession, like Gerald. The countless times Clarissa had treated me as a personal ATM, her affection directly proportional to my willingness to fund her latest whim, her interest in my life vanishing the moment the check was cashed. Thomas's voice was steady, a relentless metronome ticking off the litany of my grievances, each one a carefully documented data point in the long, sad audit of our familial dysfunction. You may recall Thomas read on, my diagnosis some months ago with a rare and aggressive neurodegenerative disorder. A diagnosis that was, I assure you, quite genuine. And the prognosis at the time was indeed dire. It was during this period, faced with my own mortality, that I made certain observations. Observations about the nature of your concern, the focus of your inquiries, the alacrity with which you began to contemplate the transition of my assets. It became painfully clear that my potential demise was viewed less as a personal tragedy and more as an impending financial event. I watched their faces contort. Arthur's usual bluster had deserted him. He looked gray, diminished. Beatrice was no longer dabbing at dry eyes. Real tears, tears of shock, and perhaps dawning shame, now streamed down her face. Clarissa's carefully constructed composure was cracking, revealing the raw, ugly avarice beneath. And so, my letter continued, through Thomas's unwavering voice, I made a decision. The experimental treatment in Switzerland, while a genuine medical necessity, also presented an opportunity to step back, to observe, to allow your true natures to reveal themselves, unconstrained by my presence or my perceived expectations. The narrative of my slow decline was, I confess, a carefully managed construct designed to give you the time and space to demonstrate the true depth of your familial affection, or lack thereof. The air in Thomas's office was now so thick with unspoken accusations and dawning horror that I could almost feel it through the audio feed. The vultures were realizing that their anticipated carrion was not only still alive, but had been watching them circle, taking meticulous notes. The charitable bequests you have just learned of, Thomas read, were indeed my genuine wish, a way to give back to the field that has given me so much. They were also, I admit, a preliminary test, a way to gauge your reactions when faced with a significant portion of your inheritance being diverted to causes you deem irrelevant. Your responses, I am told, have been entirely predictable. This was the part of the letter where I had instructed Thomas to pause, to allow the full weight of their predicament to settle upon them. I could hear the ragged breathing from Beatrice, a low moan escaping her lips. Arthur was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the mahogany table. Clarissa was bolt upright, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. This is monstrous, she finally spat, her voice trembling. He tricked us. You played us. How could it be so cruel? Thomas simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, before returning to the letter. Cruel, Clarissa, my voice echoed through him. Is it crueler than a lifetime of casual dismissal, of being valued more for my bank balance than for my presence? Is it crueler than a family who, upon hearing of a potentially terminal diagnosis, immediately begins to mentally reallocate the patient's assets? I leave that for you to ponder. The letter was far from over. The true bombshell, the one that would redefine their futures far more dramatically than any charitable endowment, was yet to come. This was merely the groundwork, the careful, methodical dismantling of their self-deception. The archivist in me appreciated the thoroughness. The son and brother in me felt a deep, weary sadness that it had ever come to this. But the engineer, the builder, knew that sometimes a faulty structure must be completely deconstructed before anything new and stable can be built in its place. Or, in this case, before it could be safely condemned and abandoned. Thomas paused, allowing the weight of my accusations, my carefully catalogued grievances, to hang in the air like a suffocating pall. Through the telescope, I saw Beatrice physically shrink, her shoulders hunched, her face buried in her now genuinely damp handkerchief. Arthur stared at his hands, clasped tightly on the table before him, the picture of a man confronted with an irrefutable, damning audit of his own soul. Clarissa, however, was a different matter. Her shock was rapidly morphing into a defiant fury, her eyes blazing, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out. This is slander, she hissed, her voice tight with rage. He was always overly sensitive, always imagining slights. We loved him. We supported him. Her definition of support, I mused, clearly involved a one-way flow of financial resources from my account to hers. Thomas, unperturbed, simply cleared his throat and continued reading from my letter. My observations from afar these past months have been enlightening. My words flowed through him. They have confirmed what I long suspected but perhaps refused to fully acknowledge, that my primary value to you, my dear family, was not as a son or a brother, but as a future benefactor. Your concern for my health seemed to run a distant second to your concern for the health of my estate. And so, with this clarity, I instructed Thomas to make certain adjustments to my long-term financial planning, adjustments that reflect this new, unvarnished understanding of our relationship. This was the pivot. The charitable bequests had been a shock, a significant reduction of their anticipated spoils. But now, the letter was hinting at something more personal, something that would directly impact them, their lifestyles, their expectations. I could almost hear their hearts pounding through the audio feed. Therefore, Thomas read, his voice taking on an even more formal, almost judicial tone, my previous testamentary instructions, the ones that provided for a, shall we say, generous and largely unconditional inheritance for each of you, have been superseded. My current and legally binding directives, drafted in full cognizance of my recent experiences and observations, outline a rather different approach to the disposition of my assets, both in the event of my actual demise and, more pertinently, during my continued, and I'm pleased to say, robustly recovering lifetime. The words robustly recovering lifetime landed like a series of precisely targeted depth charges. Beatrice let out a small, strangled cry. Arthur's head jerked up, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. Clarissa simply stared at Thomas, her mouth agape, the furious retort she had clearly been formulating dying on her lips. The ghost, it seemed, was not only very much alive, but had also been busy rewriting the script of their financial futures. Specifically, my letter continued, relentless in its calm, factual dismantling of their hopes. I have established a series of discretionary trusts. One for Arthur and Beatrice, to provide for their genuine, demonstrable healthcare needs and basic living expenses, subject to review by an independent trustee. Thomas Ashton has kindly agreed to serve in this capacity, and contingent upon, well, let's just call it a cessation of any further ill-advised speculative ventures on Arthur's part, and a more modest and sustainable approach to Beatrice's social expenditures. Arthur slumped further in his chair, the fight visibly draining out of him. The prospect of his financial activities being subject to Thomas Ashton's famously scrupulous oversight was clearly a sobering one. Beatrice looked aghast at the implication that her bridge club luncheons and charity ball contributions might now require justification. For Clarissa, Thomas read, his gaze flicking briefly towards my sister, whose face was now a mask of stunned disbelief, a similar trust has been established. Its purpose is to support genuine endeavors towards financial self-sufficiency, further education in a marketable skill, for example, or seed funding for a viable, well-researched business plan, again, subject to Thomas's rigorous approval. Funds will not be made available for speculative lifestyle brands, vanity projects, or the maintenance of a social media presence that bears little relation to actual, demonstrable achievement. Furthermore, any distributions from this trust will be contingent upon Clarissa maintaining gainful employment and making a demonstrable effort to live within her own, independently generated means. Clarissa looked as though she had been physically struck. The idea of gainful employment and living within her own means were concepts as alien to her as quantum physics. Her entire adult life had been predicated on the assumption of a never-ending stream of familial subsidy, first from her parents, then, increasingly, from me. These trusts, my letter concluded this section, are not designed to be punitive. They're designed to be corrective, to encourage a degree of prudence, self-reliance, and perhaps a belated appreciation for the value of hard-earned resources, qualities that have, I fear, been somewhat lacking in our family's recent financial comportment. They are also, I should add, entirely at my discretion to modify or dissolve, should I perceive a genuine and sustained change in attitude and behavior. Thomas paused, folding the letter carefully. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Beatrice's ragged, suppressed sobs. The vultures had not only found their anticipated feast greatly diminished by prior charitable donations. They now discovered that the remaining portions were locked away in a high-security vault, accessible only with a key held by a famously incorruptible gatekeeper, and even then, only in small, carefully measured rations, contingent on good behavior. The expressions on their faces, Arthur's dazed resignation, Beatrice's utter desolation, Clarissa's incandescent, impotent fury, were a study in thwarted avarice. It was not, perhaps, the most charitable of observations, but after a lifetime of being undervalued and exploited, I allowed myself a moment of grim, forensic satisfaction. The data was in. The discrepancies had been noted. The accounts were, finally, being reconciled according to a new and far more equitable set of principles. But the biggest reveal, the one that would shift this from a mere financial reckoning to a deeply personal confrontation, was still to come. The letter had one final, crucial postscript, and Thomas was just unfolding it. Thomas Ashton, his face an unreadable mask of professional composure, unfolded the final page of my letter. The atmosphere in his conference room, even transmitted through the imperfect medium of an audio link and a telescope, was so thick with tension it felt as if I could reach out and touch it. My family, or rather, the three individuals who constituted my biological relatives, were frozen in a tableau of shock and dawning, horrified comprehension. Their anticipated financial windfall had not just been diminished. It had been transformed into a tightly controlled allowance, contingent on the very qualities they had so conspicuously lacked: prudence, self-reliance, and a modicum of demonstrable effort. "There is one final addendum from Jonathan," Thomas announced, his voice cutting through the strained silence. He adjusted his spectacles, a small, deliberate gesture that seemed to heighten the anticipation, or perhaps dread, in the room. "P.S.," Thomas read, his tone carefully neutral, though I fancied I could detect a hint of dry amusement, a shared understanding between us, old friends and collaborators in this rather unconventional piece of legal and emotional theater. Given the surprising and, I must say, remarkably swift success of the experimental treatment I have been undergoing in Switzerland, a success that has exceeded all medical expectations, I find myself in the rather unexpected position of anticipating a full, and indeed, vigorous recovery. My physicians inform me that my prognosis is now excellent, and that I can expect to return to my full personal and professional capacities in the very near future. He paused, allowing the full weight of those words to land. Through the telescope, I saw Beatrice's head snap up, her tear-streaked face a mask of utter bewilderment. Arthur, who had been staring blankly at the polished table, slowly raised his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable. Fear? Disbelief? In their depths, Clarissa simply looked poleaxed, her earlier fury momentarily eclipsed by a new, more profound, and infinitely more personal shock. The ghost was not only dictating terms from beyond the veil. The ghost was, it seemed, about to make a rather robust comeback. In light of this unforeseen but most welcome development, Thomas continued, reading my words, which I had penned with a certain grim satisfaction. The aforementioned trust will, of course, remain in place, subject to my ongoing review and discretion. However, my primary focus will now shift from estate planning to, let's call it, active life management. And in this, my dear family, your future participation, or lack thereof, will be entirely of your own choosing and predicated on a rather significant recalibration of our previous dynamics. The implications were clear. I was alive, I was recovering, and I was very much in control of my own assets, and by extension, their access to them. The carefully constructed narrative of the dying benefactor, the grieving family, the smooth transition of wealth, it had all been a charade, a test, and they had failed it spectacularly. I expect to be returning to the city within the next few weeks, my letter went on, each word a precisely aimed dart. And I would be interested, though perhaps not entirely surprised, to learn of any arrangements you may have already made regarding the disposition of my personal effects, the management of my properties, or indeed, any premature eulogies you may have been composing. Thomas has been instructed to provide me with a full accounting of all such activities undertaken in my supposed absence. Clarissa let out a strangled gasp. I knew for a fact from discreet inquiries Thomas had made that she had already contacted an estate agent to get a valuation on my city apartment, and had even been discussing with a high-end auction house the potential sale of my art collection. Arthur, I suspected, had likely been eyeing my portfolio of tech stocks with a view to diversifying them into his own, more adventurous ventures. Beatrice was probably already planning how to redecorate my country house. Their plans, their presumptions, were now laid bare, exposed by the inconvenient fact of my continued existence. This is a trick, Clarissa finally burst out, her voice shrill. He's lying. He's trying to torment us. Thomas, you can't believe this. He's terminally ill. You told us yourself. Thomas simply raised an eyebrow. Ms. Hayes, I relayed the information Jonathan provided to me regarding his medical condition and his wishes. The information regarding his remarkable recovery is more recent, and, I assure you, backed by corroborating medical reports from his Swiss physicians, which he has authorized me to share with you, should you doubt his veracity. He gestured to another, even thicker, file on the table. The thoroughness of it, the irrefutable documentation, seemed to visibly deflate Clarissa. She sank back in her chair, her face a battleground of conflicting emotions, fury, humiliation, and a dawning, terrified understanding of just how completely she had miscalculated. Arthur finally spoke, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. He's alive? Jonathan is coming back. There was a note of something in his voice that wasn't just fear of financial retribution. Was it a flicker of genuine paternal concern, or merely the shock of a carefully laid plan unraveling? It was hard to tell, even for me, his son, the lifelong student of his complex and often disappointing character. Beatrice was simply weeping, silent, shuddering sobs that shook her small frame. The lace handkerchief was now a sodden ruin. My letter had one final parting shot. And so, my dear family, Thomas read, his voice now carrying a note of undeniable finality, consider this not an ending, but a new beginning. A beginning where our relationships, if they are to continue at all, will be based not on obligation, expectation, or financial dependency, but on genuine, mutual respect and affection, commodities that have, I fear, been in rather short supply. The choice, as always, is yours. I shall be observing your future conduct with considerable interest. Sincerely, your son and brother, Jonathan, who, it seems, will be seeing you all again very soon. Thomas carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Beatrice's weeping. The play was over. The reviews, as it were about to come in the form of their future actions. And I, from my discreet observation post, felt not triumph, not a desire for revenge, but a deep, weary sadness and a sliver of something else, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this brutal, necessary shock might, in the long run, lead to something more authentic, more honest, even if it was just a clearer, more respectful distance between us. The assets were secure. The truth was out. The next act was up to them. But the stage and the script were now firmly under my control. And the first scene of that new act was about to begin as I reached for my own phone, a new set of instructions ready for Thomas Ashton. The curtain was, in a very real sense, just rising. The immediate aftermath of Thomas Ashton finishing my letter was, as I had anticipated, a maelstrom of disbelief, recrimination, and a dawning, horrified realization of their predicament. Clarissa, predictably, was the first to find her voice, or rather, her shriek. "He can't do this. This is psychological torture. We'll sue. We'll get our own lawyers. Bartholomew Thorne will—" Her voice trailed off as she likely remembered that Bartholomew Thorne, her previous legal eagle, was now facing his own professional credibility issues, thanks in no small part to his ill-advised association with her and her premature grab for my estate. Thomas, ever the calm center in the storm, simply waited for her outburst to subside. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone devoid of judgment but firm, "your brother is perfectly within his rights to manage his assets as he sees fit, particularly given his remarkable recovery. The trusts he has established are legally sound and reflect his current, clearly expressed intentions. Any legal challenge on your part would be, in my professional opinion, protracted, costly, and unlikely to succeed, especially given the, shall we say, documented history of your family's financial interactions with Mr. Hayes. Arthur, my father, seemed to have aged a decade in the last hour. He looked gray, almost spectral, his usual bluster completely extinguished. He kept shaking his head, muttering, 'Alive, he's alive.' Jonathan, it was unclear whether this was an expression of shock, relief, or simply the dazed repetition of a man whose entire worldview had just been upended. Beatrice, my mother, had dissolved into a puddle of genuine, if self-pitying, despair. 'But we loved him,' she wailed, her voice muffled by her sodden handkerchief. 'We always loved him. We were just worried about his future, worried about him being alone.' Her definition of love and worry, I reflected, had always been rather elastic, capable of stretching to accommodate a remarkable degree of self-interest. It was at this precise moment, as the emotional shrapnel from my letter was still flying, that I made my own move. I had instructed Thomas, as a final flourish, that upon his finishing the letter, he was to make a brief, seemingly innocuous phone call. I watched through the telescope as Thomas picked up his desk phone, dialed a single preset number, and said, simply, "Mr. Ashton here. The preliminary discussion is concluded. You may proceed as planned." He then replaced the receiver. My family, caught up in their own turmoil, barely registered the call. They were too busy arguing amongst themselves, Clarissa accusing her parents of not having managed Jonathan better in his youth, Beatrice blaming Arthur for his feckless financial example, which had clearly, in her mind, driven Jonathan to such unnatural secrecy about his wealth. Arthur just sat there, looking utterly defeated. Less than 2 minutes later, There was a polite but firm knock on the conference room door. Thomas, with a perfectly feigned look of mild surprise, rose to open it. Standing in the doorway was a uniformed chauffeur, the same impeccably attired gentleman who had, in a different narrative, driven me to the airport for my final journey to Switzerland some months prior. Today, however, he was not there to facilitate an exit, but an entrance. "Excuse me, Mr. Ashton," the chauffeur said, his voice a model of discreet professionalism. "Mr. Jonathan Hayes has arrived. He asked me to inform you that he is waiting in your private reception area and would be grateful if his family could join him there at their earliest convenience." The effect of these simple words was electric. If my letter had been a bombshell, this was the aftershock, the one that brought down any remaining teetering structures of denial. Beatrice let out a piercing shriek. Arthur actually recoiled in his chair as if he'd seen a ghost. Clarissa's face went from flushed fury to a stark, chalky white. The man they believed to be thousands of miles away, slowly succumbing to a fatal illness, the man whose assets they had just been informed were now largely beyond their reach, was not only alive and well, but was, in fact, in the next room, waiting to see them. The sheer audacious theatricality of it, I had to admit, appealed to the part of me that had always appreciated a well-constructed, perfectly timed reveal, a skill honed, perhaps, during years of debugging complex software algorithms where the final, elegant solution often appears only after a series of carefully orchestrated tests. Thomas, his face a mask of impeccable neutrality, gestured towards the door. "Well," he said, his voice calm amidst the rising tide of familial hysteria, "it seems Jonathan is more eager to reconnect than we anticipated. Shall we?" There was no graceful way for them to refuse. Trapped by social convention, by the sheer, stunning reality of the situation, they rose, almost as one, their movements stiff, uncoordinated, like marionettes whose strings had suddenly been tangled. I watched them file out of the conference room, Clarissa shooting a look of pure venom at Thomas, Beatrice leaning heavily on Arthur, who seemed to be navigating less by sight and more by a dazed, horrified instinct. I gave him a few moments' head start, then, taking a deep breath, I rose from my own observation post. It was time for the author of this particular drama to take his place on stage, to deliver his lines in person. The walk across the street, from the Spartan anonymity of my rented office to the familiar, opulent comfort of Thomas Ashton's firm, felt like traversing a lifetime. So many years of quiet disappointment, of unacknowledged effort, of being seen not as a person, but as a resource. That chapter was now definitively closed. A new one was beginning, one where the terms of engagement would be entirely and irrevocably my own. As I entered Thomas's private reception area, a tastefully appointed room with comfortable leather armchairs and discreet modern art, they were already there, clustered together like frightened sheep, a stark contrast to their earlier predatory confidence. Thomas stood slightly apart, a silent, observant sentinel. They turned as I entered, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they saw me. Not the abstract concept of Jonathan Hayes, the dying son, the anticipated benefactor, but me, Jonathan Hayes, alive, recovered, and very much in control. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Beatrice, true to form, burst into a fresh torrent of tears, a sound that was, for once, perhaps not entirely performative. The reunion, I suspected, was going to be memorable. Respect had formed between us, a fragile bridge built across years of misunderstanding. He even, on one memorable occasion, sheepishly admitted that his latest venture, a surprisingly sensible online course teaching basic woodworking skills to retirees, had been inspired, in part, by my own dedication to my obscure passions. Beatrice's transformation was more subtle, less intellectual, more social. Her volunteer work at the library seemed to provide her with a new sense of purpose, a community outside her usual bridge club circle. She started reading more, her conversation less focused on gossip and material possessions, more on the books she was discovering, the local author talks she was attending. Her calls to me, while still infrequent, became less about her own needs and more about genuinely inquiring after my well-being. She even, once, sent me a small, thoughtfully chosen first edition of a classic science fiction novel she'd found at a library book sale, with a note saying, "This reminded me of the sort of thing you always enjoyed, Jonathan. Hope you're keeping well." It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Clarissa remained the most complex variable in this evolving familial equation. Her journey towards self-sufficiency was, shall we say, iterative. The small business management course did not, alas, magically transform her into a titan of industry. There were several more ill-fated attempts at launching online ventures, each one slightly less grandiose than the last. However, Thomas Ashton, in his role as trustee, remained steadfast, providing carefully measured support for genuine educational endeavors. She eventually completed a certificate in digital marketing, but firmly declining to fund what he termed aspirational branding exercises with no discernible revenue model. Gradually, painstakingly, Clarissa began to find her footing. She started doing freelance social media management for small local businesses, a role that combined her flair for presentation with her newly acquired digital marketing skills. It wasn't the glamorous empire she had once envisioned, but it was honest work, and for the first time in her adult life, she was earning her own independent income, however modest. Her interactions with me became less frequent, but also less charged. The old entitlement was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being replaced by a hesitant, almost wary respect. She once called to ask my advice on a particularly tricky software issue she was having with a client's website, a conversation that was entirely professional, entirely devoid of any underlying financial agenda. It was, in its own way, a quiet miracle. Thomas Ashton, my solicitor and friend, remained a constant, steady presence. We'd meet for lunch every few months, ostensibly to review the trust accounts, but mostly to catch up, to share a quiet laugh about the absurdities of life, and to reflect on the peculiar journey we had navigated together. "You know, Jonathan," he said to me once, a rare smile on his usually stoic face, "in all my years of legal practice, I've dealt with some rather colorful family disputes. But yours? Yours takes the proverbial biscuit. The sheer audacious theatricality of it all. Your father would have appreciated the craftsmanship, I think. The meticulous planning, the perfectly timed reveals. A masterpiece of posthumous persuasion, even if the posthumous part turned out to be somewhat premature." I simply nodded, a private smile playing on my own lips. Dad would have indeed appreciated the irony, the careful construction, the ultimate, satisfying click of all the pieces falling into place. My life, once so entangled with the insatiable needs and unexamined assumptions of my family, had found a new, simpler, and far more fulfilling equilibrium. I had my work, my friends, my quiet passions. I had even, to my own surprise, started to build a new romantic relationship with a charming, intelligent woman I'd met at a historical society lecture. A woman who valued conversation over couture and whose interest in my life extended beyond my net worth. The letter, that fateful missive read aloud in Thomas Ashton's conference room, had been a necessary act of demolition. It had cleared away the rotten, unstable structures of a dysfunctional past, but it had also, unexpectedly, cleared the ground for new growth, for the possibility of healthier, more authentic connections, even with those who had once caused so much pain. The healing was slow, imperfect, and ongoing, but it was real. The man who had been let to die by his family's indifference had not only survived, but had, in the process, perhaps taught them something about the true meaning of life, of value, of connection. And in that, I found a quiet, enduring satisfaction that no amount of inherited wealth could ever have provided. The final accounts of this particular family ledger were, at last, beginning to balance.